Probably the second worst kept secret of the 2024 Formula 1 season was announced yesterday. The first worst kept secret being the Adrian Newey to Aston Martin stuff. A very popular driver has now left his team. That bit made it sound like he's dead, didn't it? But he's not dead. He's here tonight. No, he's just left his team. He's not dead, but his Formula 1 career might be. I've made this worse somehow, haven't I? Daniel Ricciardo has been released from Credit Card Toro Tauri Alpha Balls Red Racing things, or whatever they're called now. It's RB, isn't it? But it will always be Toro Rosso to me, or even Minardi before that. But either way, it brings to an end several months of speculation as to whether or not the Honey Badger's time in F1 will continue, as his head has been on the chopping block for some time. It's been a bit, well, divisive. Some people want him around longer, and others are happy to see the back of him. So what's happened? Why this and why this now? Well, that's what we're here to have a look at. Ricciardo is going to be replaced by Liam Lawson, who has apparently known that he was going to be replacing Ricciardo for about a fortnight or so, while Ricciardo apparently, well, didn't. Speaking to a New Zealand radio station, Lawson said the situation wasn't exactly great, knowing that he was in the garages at Baku and Singapore, knowing that he was going to be replacing Ricciardo. But Ricciardo didn't have any inkling as to whether or not he was going to be off. On Friday, Ricciardo's body language showed that he had an idea as to what was going to be happening, and then after the race in Singapore, it was clear that he knew his time was up. Now, it's official. And the situation has been up in the air for some time. Not just Ricciardo, but Sergio Perez at the other Red Bull team has also been under the microscope, as his performance relative to Verstappen this season has been incredibly poor since the car stopped being as overpowered as it was last year, and Perez has been involved in a few incidents where he could be deemed at fault. Most recent being an incident with Sainz at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix that eliminated him from a potential podium place, and then gifting that podium place to Russell. As a result of his poor performances where he sits 8th in the standings while Verstappen still leads the championship, Perez has been under the microscope, constantly, but he was offered a new contract earlier this year that keeps him locked in. But with Red Bull being the operation that it is, there could still be performance-related clauses in the contract that would allow Perez to be dumped off for someone else if the need arises. But the situation with Lawson is made a tiny bit more complicated. The situation seems to be part of the ongoing off-track dramas at Red Bull, stuff that I've talked about a few hundred times by now. This being beyond the departures of Adrian Newey, Jonathan Wheatley and now Chief Strategist Will Courtney, and this is also on top of the alleged WhatsApp messages, the suspended Red Bull employee, and the bickering between the Verstappens, Horner, Marko and everything else. Rumours are that Marko wants Lawson in one of the 4 Red Bull cars by the start of the 2025 season and has made promises and guarantees to Lawson that this will be the case. Horner, on the other hand, wants to keep Ricciardo in the car. Whatever reasons those are, it's not known. Maybe because commercially he's a great fit. He smiles a lot, the fans like him, and bits and pieces like that. And Perez is pretty much kept around for the same reason. He is big in Mexico in terms of merchandise sales and other bits and bobs. But he can't be that popular because I've never seen him on a billboard in Mexico. Adrian Fernandez was infinitely more popular. That's a IndyCar reference right there. But for Ricciardo, him rejoining the Red Bull Junior team was almost like a lifeline offered to him last season. After leaving McLaren where he won the 2021 Italian Grand Prix, Ricciardo was invited back into the Red Bull operation and was scheduled to be their test and reserve driver, just in case. In turn, Nick De Vries was brought into AlphaTauri alongside Yuki Tsunoda, and while Tsunoda was able to finish around the top 10, De Vries was struggling and only finished higher than 14th just once, when he finished 12th at Monaco. After the British Grand Prix, De Vries was dumped from AlphaTauri and Ricciardo brought in, finishing 13th and 16th before having to withdraw from the Dutch Grand Prix because he'd broken his hand in a crash. Lawson took over for the next 5 races, scoring a 9th place at the Singapore Grand Prix and scored 2 11th places as well. When Ricciardo returned, he managed the 7th place at Mexico, AlphaTauri's highest finish of the season, but in the head-to-head between Tsunoda and Ricciardo, Daniel only beat his younger teammate twice. Vegas excluded because Tsunoda retired, but was classified due to completing 90% race distance. Lawson, on the other hand, has a 100% record against Tsunoda. Yeah, but, I can hear you cry, he's been out of F1 for a bit, he needed to get back into things and he broke his hand and missed more races, so he was a bit rusty. And this then leads me into the 2024 season, where he would supposedly do every race and crush Tsunoda, and then get back into the senior Red Bull team once Perez was kicked aside for being rubbish. The thing is, while Ricciardo beat Tsunoda at Bahrain and finished one position behind at Jeddah, Yuki then went on a run of 5 points paying positions, only interrupted by a non-finish in China. At the Canadian Grand Prix, Ricciardo seemed to hit some form, beating Yuki 3 times in a row, but with only an 8th and 9th to show for it, the 8th place in Canada being Ricciardo's first points of the season. At Silverstone and Hungary, Yuki scored while Ricciardo didn't, and at Belgium, Ricciardo got a single point before beating Yuki at Zandvoort. Then, in Singapore, Yuki was 12th and Ricciardo was last, in a weekend that was not to be one to remember even before it was announced that it would be his last weekend. So in the championship standings, Yuki is sat in 12th on 22 points. Ricciardo is in 14th behind Albon on countback on 12. Ollie Behrman, who has done just 2 races all year, is only 5 points behind Ricciardo. In the eyes of Red Bull management, it's probably not what they were expecting. I think some of them were expecting that he would come in, beat Tsunoda convincingly, and then get promoted up to the senior Red Bull team to replace Perez, because obviously Perez hasn't been doing that well. As it is, Daniel hasn't been performing that well either, and is now being replaced by Lawson. So while Perez has been sort of on the chopping block for some time because he's not been good enough, the potential replacement hasn't been making a convincing case. So why now? Why not at the end of the season? Why not after the US Grand Prix so Ricciardo can have a proper send-off? The simple answer is, the next Grand Prix is in 3 weeks. It makes more sense for Lawson to be told he's in the car for the next Grand Prix now so he can get the preparation in, he can get the simulator time in, he can get all that done and they can get him in sooner rather than later and still have all of that time available to prepare him. Yes, if he comes in for Mexico, he'd have a little bit longer to prepare, but why wait until Mexico when they can do it in time for Austin? This would hopefully give him more momentum into 2025, and who knows, if he does well enough between now and the same point we're at today, next year, he might have Perez's seat by the end of the 2025 season. If Verstappen goes through with his quitting threats either at the end of next season or at the end of 2026 or whenever he decides to go, I mean this only really applies if Verstappen decides to go at the end of next year, Red Bull have got at least one driver that they can put the weight behind and then maybe get George Russell in. But there's actually a more important reason. Lawson will be a free agent at the end of this season. If Red Bull puts him in now, they get 6 races to evaluate him as a driver, and if they don't want him around, they can move him on. And they've got Isaac Hadjar in Formula 2 who is looking for an F1 seat too. With Tsunoda already under contract for next year, then you've got 2 drivers looking for 1 seat. If Lawson isn't good enough, then Hadjar will get the seat instead. So it's a bit all up in the air with a lot of things at that operation at the minute. It's effectively a job interview, an audition. There's the possibility that if Lawson batters Tsunoda over the next 6 races, he could be moved up into Perez's seat, which is what people hoped Ricciardo would do. So maybe this is what all this George Russell stuff is about, because if Perez is replaced by Lawson and Max quits, they're going to need to find somebody else to come in because Hadjar might not be good enough to be promoted yet. The thing is though, this doesn't paint Red Bull in a very good light, whichever way you look at it. One junior driver coming in with no guarantees of next year, another junior driver itching to get into Formula 1 after performing incredibly well in F2, and this being at the same time that 2 other drivers in Formula 2, Antonelli and Colapinto, have been signed up to teams in one way or another without the same points tallies. Hadjar is going to want to make a very good case for Red Bull or AlphaTauri hiring him and doesn't want to be the next in what is becoming a line of drivers finishing high up in F2 and not making it into F1 the following year. For reference, Hadjar is second in the standings, 4.5 points off the top, but the top 6 in the standings aren't a million miles apart this year, and it also has to be said that success or lack of success in F2 doesn't necessarily translate like for like into Formula 1. Look at Colapinto and how his lack of success in Formula 2 has translated to what he's doing at Williams. Similarly, Nico Hülkenberg is a GP2 champion. Guy's never had a podium in, 200 and some odd races? But this is something that has become almost a feature of the Red Bull system. Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon and Pierre Gasly were all Red Bull juniors and have all left the operation. The price of leaving is becoming journeyman drivers, to an extent. Sainz went to Renault, McLaren and is now at Ferrari. Albon was demoted, then had to sit out, but is making a comeback with Williams now, so that's good to see. And Gasly ended up at the senior team only to be dumped as well, only to go and win a race with the junior team, which is something only Vettel has done. It seems that Red Bull has too many drivers, while other academies seem to put all their stock in one driver and then see where things go. McLaren famously had Hamilton, then they had Magnussen, then Van Dorn, and now Norris. Ferrari's pet project for a long time was Leclerc, and then Mick Schumacher came up. Renault had Kubica, Grosjean, and now Doohan. Mercedes had Wehrlein, Ocon, and Russell. Now their stock is in Antonelli. Red Bull, on the other hand, how many drivers have got Red Bull logos on their cars? You've got Verstappen as the number one. That's a given, right? Because the guy's just that good. Then you've got Tsunoda in the B team, who is really just the benchmark for the new kids. But then that leaves 2 seats, or 1 in this case. There often seems to be 3, sometimes 4 people in for that 1 seat. There's going to be the driver that gets the seat, and the others have to sit around hoping that the driver that got the seat flops so that they then get their chance. And with Perez being signed up during the 2020 season and a 34-year-old Ricciardo brought back for 2023, then what's the point in having those juniors if they're not going to get a seat? And swinging people in and out as if it's a fantasy football team doesn't do anybody any favours. If you dump one driver and replace them and that new driver ends up being a success, you look like a management genius. If it doesn't pull off, or when it doesn't get pulled off, you look silly. And everybody's going to go, well, what's the point in just flip-flopping everybody around? Basically, what Red Bull is doing is they're giving these kids a sword and sticking them in the Colosseum. If they live, brilliant. But if they die, they die. And the reaction to Daniel being kicked aside for Lawson has got people angered. He deserved better. And in the case of deserved better, he deserved at least some indication of being let go. Like being told at the same time that Lawson was, or told earlier in the season that this could be the case. Because telling the kid and not telling the driver who is currently in the car, that's a bit of a dick move. People also don't like it because of how popular Daniel is and how funny he is and all that stuff. But as somebody pointed out online, Formula 1 is not a sentimental sport. Jackie Stewart said a phrase that is applicable to all jobs and professions and not just something limited to sports. There is always someone else. If you aren't at the level that people expect, you'll be given warnings and then you're gone. If you're slacking off at work, you're going to be involved in a quiet word with management. In a sports sense, if you don't pull your weight and you end up finishing behind your teammates, or you keep making mistakes that lead to the opposition scoring goals and whatever, you're going to get dropped for another player. And if you're expected to come in and regularly beat your teammate only for that teammate to start beating you, then that's going to reflect badly on you. I understand why Ricciardo was dumped. He's just not been good enough, and I'm sorry if that upsets anybody, but that's just my opinion. It doesn't make me a hater because we've seen before how good he can be. But as I told Glenn Freeman about, half an hour ago, imagine if the work experience kid found out that you were going to be sacked before you got sacked. It's just something that would never happen. Losing a popular character on the grid is still a loss though. Ricciardo had that smile and cheeky chappy thing off the track, but on the track he became something else, with his aggressive lunges and all of that stuff. It's why he's called the Honey Badger. But some have suggested that maybe he got a little bit too lost in that persona. Others suggest it might be that he couldn't get his head around the current spec of cars, and they're just not suited to his driving style. Some are saying that he was never that good anyway and plateaued while he was at Red Bull, but that's the way the cards fall sometimes. Carlos Sainz left the Red Bull setup to replace Jolyon Palmer at Renault. He then went to McLaren and then ended up at Ferrari, where it was a case of, oh wow, it looks like it all paid off for him. But that will all end when Hamilton takes over his seat next season, which is something that is still weird to say. Hamilton at Ferrari. But then Vettel at Ferrari was weird too. Next season, Sainz will be at Williams, and it will either be something he sticks with, or he'll be back to being a Martin Brundle-style journeyman. Ricciardo left Red Bull to go to Renault, just like Sainz did, and then he went to McLaren, just like Sainz did. And to be fair to Daniel, his 2020 season at Renault was pretty decent, but McLaren didn't exactly go as expected. But he did win at Monza. It's one more win than Norris got in that same time frame. But what's going to sting for Daniel is what's happened to McLaren since then. They're now the fastest car on the track. They're now leading the Constructors' Championship standings. Piastri has got 2 wins with McLaren. So it's going to be a case of, what if I'd stayed? But at the same time, there's no guarantees that things would have worked out exactly the same had he stayed at McLaren or stayed at Renault. But it might be something he might be thinking, because you're going to, aren't you? So what's next for him? NASCAR? IndyCar? I think he's ruled both of them out, which in the case of NASCAR doesn't make sense, because he's a massive Yankophile and loves Dale Earnhardt. And going to NASCAR with Shane Van Gisbergen, Cam Waters and Will Brown also getting involved would give NASCAR that Australian invasion effect, similar to the British invasion of the Indy 500 in the 60s, or how Indy now has Power, Dixon and McLaughlin today. If nothing works out in terms of racing, he would slide into a broadcast career easily. He's got the charisma, he's got the appeal, he's got the knowledge, he's got the banter, so he could end up as a pundit on Sky Sports, along with the other 997 people they've got in that crew. Or he could hook up with Mark Webber and co over on Channel 4 in the UK. The way it's not worked out, it's just what it is. And it is a little sad to see, since we were all raving about this guy 10 years ago, saying that he would be a champion given the right car, and he made Vettel run away from Red Bull. But the scary thing is, Vettel, after leaving Red Bull, ended up having more title shots than Ricciardo did. That's weird to think. But at the same time, it's also an indication as to the wider problems of Red Bull's operating style. So then, some opinions on the Honey Badger being ousted from Credit Cards R Us, Contactless Payment, Bull Red, Rosso Minardi. If you have your own opinions and ideas, do leave them down in the comments section and get a discussion going, because the more sane comments on an internet can end up generating thought processes that you see in these kinds of videos. And while scrolling down to the comments, if you haven't done already, like the video so I know a good job was done, and also get subscribed to the channel and get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep things running around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know, as well as affiliate links with the F1 store and Mix Garage. There's also super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee, and memberships if you want to do Patreon without the Patreon bit. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.